My name is Adam Chesler. I'm with the American Institute of Physics Publishing, and I'm one of the conference directors here. So we have 4 speakers. I'm going to go in the order to which they are standing or seating here. We have, forgive me, it's been such a long week. Joel Pitts from Kansas State University, Karen Rupp-Serrano from the University of Oklahoma, Angie Oler from the University of Maryland, and Leanne Pope, also from the University of Maryland. So these are our speakers today. We will have time, I said, for questions at the end, so hold them till we get wrapped up with the presentations. So without further ado, I'm going to let Angie take over.
Okay, I'm going to remind you to go ahead and take the survey if you haven't already. That will close during the session, so please do that if you can. Go ahead and start this. Am I hitting the right one? Okay. Wait, where's that? Found it. Ah. Okay, great. So I feel I should give some background as to how this presentation came about. At the University of Maryland, this was our first experience with canceling a big deal. Not a new thing, we're aware. Nonetheless, we started to wonder, gosh, is our experience the norm? So I reached out to Karen at OU, who in turn reached out to Joelle at Kansas State. And after we started to talk a bit, we realized, wow, this might be actually a good session, particularly to give a sense of what it's like to cancel a big deal, what other institutions might expect in terms of the impact of the decisions that they're making, as well as the relative success or not of communication strategies about those decisions. This is what we intend to cover today. The most important part, and I'm sure the reason why many of you are here, are the survey results, and those will be revealed toward the end of the session. We thought it might be kind of fun to give you an idea of the combined statistics between our institutions. We decided on 2017 because that seemed to be the common year in which we were starting to make these decisions about big deals. So this big dollar amount here represents the combined annual funds across our 3 institutions spent on big deals, a rather large number. Perhaps even more striking, this represents 40% of our combined annual budgets. Serving just a little under 81,000 FTE, even more striking, this represents 14 big deals from only 8 publishers in the marketplace. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joelle to talk about the Kansas State experience.
All right. Put this up a little bit. Okay, thank you very much, Angie. My name is Joelle Pitts. I'm the head of content development at Kansas State University. And I will start, as Angie indicated, with a bit of an overview of our institutional context for these decisions. So we are the 2nd largest university in Kansas. We are the state land-grant university, and as of our 20th day statistics, we're sitting at about 18,000 FTE. Our annual expenditures exceed 14 million, though I'll go into some more details on the nuances there in a moment. And about 5.8 million of that is designated for collections, both print and online. Of our collections, we've got roughly 6.5 million volumes, 1.9 ebooks, over 12,000 e-journals, 264 databases that we subscribe to or otherwise fund. And then our memberships include that in the Greater Western Library Alliance, HathiTrust, and the West Storage Trust. So while our budget has technically remained stable over the last several years, our allocations have decreased steadily over the last several years to the tune of about $1.6 million in total. And so that, of course, for us has resulted in wide-scale cancellations, including those packaged in big deals. We've also, this last fiscal year, had to institute a print moratorium. So we ended up turning off all of our approval plans, and we only purchased print materials that were either funded by endowments or other alternative funding sources, or that were listed as critical or necessary for coursework at K-State. This, of course, has meant for us continued increasing emphasis on continuation spending, which is not unique to us, of course. And our current continuations to monograph ratio is sitting at about 96% to 4%, which I think is skewed a little more deeply than the average, but not by much. And so just for context, up here I've listed out our major cancellation efforts over the last several years. From 14 to 18, we canceled in the realm of $730,000 of materials, over 2,600 individual titles and resources. And then this last fiscal year, which has been our worst yet, we ended up canceling about $500,000 in materials, a little over 600 individual titles and resources. So up to this past fiscal year, our communication with our campus and with our libraries, I think in general, was not fantastic. But we did make some efforts to communicate why we're doing this, the underlying rationale behind doing this, the serials crisis, and so on. But this fiscal year, in 19, we made an overt effort to improve our communications with our campus with regard to this issue. And so one of the first things that we did before the latest round of cancellations was institute a collections communications team. That group is inclusive of myself, my dean, my associate dean for collections, our head of acquisitions, head of academic services, and our communications officer. And all of us work to create a multifaceted communications approach for our library and for our campus, which includes some of the activities that you see listed up here, public and written verbal announcements. My dean and I did an open forum earlier this year for the campus talking about the serials crisis. We shared things like the flyer that you see here that lists our budget information, of course our local information, but also contrasts that with the national trends that we're seeing in the serials crisis at large. And then we've been communicating at various levels with our top campus leadership. So our first Tuesday meetings, college and departmental meetings, deans, directors, those types of things. We're communicating intentionally and hopefully transparently with all of those groups. One of our strategies, I think this time around too, was to be more intentional about using data. We tried very hard to make our decisions data informed, both qualitative and quantitative. And we also tried to increase the transparency around the rationale that we used for these decisions. And so what you see up here, the image that you see is a screenshot of a cancellation database that we created in Power BI. It lists all of our cancellations over the last several fiscal years by type, by title, and by fiscal year, and also the total amount of the reduction for those years. And then finally, we really wanted to emphasize campus feedback. So we use the counter data, we use lots of different metrics on the technical side of the house, but we wanted to ensure that not only were our faculty and our resources and our researchers and our students having their voices heard, but that we were actually utilizing their feedback in our decision-making process. So we really emphasized that this year. And one of the things that has come out of this communications effort, or the increased focus on communication and transparency, which I think is a really good thing, is the creation of a scholarly communication task force, a campus-wide task force. Our provost is very interested and in tune with this issue on our campus, and he worked with our dean to create and charge this group. And I'm not going to read all of these bullet points to you. I've just copied and pasted some of our action items and steps from that charge. But I think that it is reflective that we've been successful, at least in terms of raising awareness of this issue all the way up to the top echelons of our campus leadership, resulting in groups like this. Internal impacts, these will probably not be surprising to most of you in this room, but I'll go through these quickly. We are trying to avoid new multi-year deals, and especially those that do not include financial distress clauses. We are not signing NDAs, primarily so that we can be more transparent with our campus constituents about the pricing and what we're spending our very scarce resources on. We're in a continuous review cycle. There's very few renewals that come through that we don't look at in some way or other before we send those through or not. Data analysis, this is becoming an increased focus for us, so much so that we are hiring a data analyst for my unit to help us with this. We're focused more on forecasting, so not just for the current fiscal year, but 2 and 3 fiscal years out. We're trying to project what this will mean for us in terms of spend, but also in terms of where we want to strategically put our dollars. Project management and timing, of course, we've had to refocus on some of that. Our approval plans are still turned off. Some of that's due to a fire that we had last year, but a lot of it has to do with our continued budgetary issues. And then we will continue to cancel for inflation. It's just a reality for us. Some of the most surprising impacts, I think, that we have seen on our campus with regard to cancellation of big deals and other resources is our interlibrary loan impact, or non-impact in our case. And so what you're seeing here is data that I've asked our interlibrary loan folks to pull for us that are inclusive of the total number of articles that we're seeing requested in all of our areas and the amount that we're paying for those things. And so just to give you some context, these are just the copyright clearance fees. These are just the charges that we're paying over and above the membership fees and Rapid and reprint stuff and things like that. And we're trying to get closer to a more accurate number that reflects those membership fees and the staff time that's involved in some of this. But all else equal, we are seeing relatively little impact in terms of our interlibrary loan, both in numbers and in cost. And then the external impacts, again, these won't be revelatory to anyone in this room, I'm sure, but the negative impacts on our campus include morale. Our faculty are tired of hearing from us about more cancellations. I think they roll their eyes every time they see me coming down the hall because they know what I'm going to be talking about is not to their advantage, at least in terms of access. Service reduction, reduced access, and new program support. So our new budget model really incentivizes the creation of new programs, and we are having a really difficult time wrapping our minds around how we support new programs in terms of resources in this environment. And then some positive effects are happening out of this. And one is transparency. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. I'm trying very, very hard to make our collections decisions and rationale more transparent to our libraries and to our campus. Advocacy, again, all the way up to the top of our university leadership. Our provost is paying attention and he's acting on that, which I really appreciate. And that has resulted in the Scholarly Communication Task Force. So overall, I think we have had a similar experience to many of you, I'm sure. But now I'm going to turn this over to Karen so she can talk a little bit about the OU experience.
Okay, so at the University of Oklahoma Libraries, we are the largest research university in Oklahoma. We have about 25,000 FTE, and that's just for the Norman campus. There's also a Tulsa campus and a health sciences campus. We have about a $20 million annual expenditure for the main campus library system. About half of that goes to our materials budget, and we're ranked 53rd among ARLs. You can see we have over 5 million volumes, over 1 million e-books, close to 8,000 e-journals, and over 300 databases. Like K-State, we're a member of Gwilla, HathiTrust, and the Western Storage Trust. So to put things in context for OU, we've had flat budgets pretty much, and then budget cuts throughout fiscal year 11 through fiscal year 19. That's resulted in a deepening book and serial imbalance. In fiscal year 2010, we had about 24% of our budget was spent on books. Last year, it was under 10%, so we've gone from a quarter to under 10%. What we've cut has been very similar to what K-State has cut. It's been about the same dollar amount. The difference, two big differences, we did ours in a much more compact time frame, and we had a much larger budget to begin with. So we probably aren't hurting as bad as K-State is. In fiscal year 18, we had a university mandated permanent library budget reduction of almost $400,000. And then in fiscal year 19, there was another budget reduction of over $1 million to the library budget, and the collections budget took $900,000 of that. We were allowed to do it across 2 fiscal years, last year and the current year. So for our decisions, to back up just a little bit, in 2014, we actually canceled a relatively small big deal agreement with Oxford. And we did that primarily because we could see that coming down the road we would have to cancel others, and we thought we'd start with something small and try to prepare our campus, try to get them engaged. We had a public presentation where we talked about what the process was going to be like, how we were going to do this, how we were going to get feedback. I'm sorry to report that there were more librarians and library administrators than there were faculty there. We also made an offer to meet with any department to speak to Faculty Senate, and we didn't get any uptake there either. So we didn't get a lot of traction that first time around in trying to get our campus to understand what some of the issues were. However, we did develop an online guide in support of canceling the agreement. At the end, you'll see the URL for that. That guide provides general information, so some information on what big deals are, information on the national and OU trends so people can see that OU is not an outlier, and frequently asked questions. We also provide detailed information. We go over our methodology, we provide all the usage data, and we have those giant spreadsheets that run A through Z and then AA through, you know, a lot more. So all the usage data and an interpretive key because it is so complex, and then on that guide, we also list both our final retention recommendations and decisions and non-retention, both. We really try to be very, very transparent, but to balance transparency with comprehension, because frankly, we could go into so much detail that everyone's eyes would glaze over, you know, and it would be done. And we've continued to expand this guide as we've moved into other cancellation projects. So in terms of our decisions, all the big deals that we've canceled after we got out of Oxford have been driven by our university mandated permanent budget reductions. And except for an Elsevier journal agreement that we left last fall under an accelerated timeline because we were given this $900,000 to cut in 2 years. Our standard communication strategy, it goes on in the spring, and it has both internal and external components. So in January, we begin with our initial internal and external notifications. We give something to the librarians, a standard email so that the same language goes out to everyone, so we have a consistent message. We have a monthly newsletter that goes out during the regular academic year, and that information is also in there. We have a University Libraries Committee that has representation from faculty across campus. We discuss the project with them, and we get their feedback before we launch. I want to stress that we really strongly encourage departmental feedback throughout the process. I know you'll be very surprised to hear that we always hear we haven't given enough time for feedback, but that all feedback comes in the last week to 10 days, no matter how long you give or when you schedule it. In February through mid-March, we set our internal reduction targets, and we break this into a STEM target, a social sciences, an arts and humanities, and a business. When we did Oxford, we rolled business in with social sciences, and we learned that's not a good idea. Business will just overtake all the money you put into that category, so we just treat them separately. We set out the data for developing those initial retention recommendations, and again, that's both internal and external in terms of where that's communicated. By mid-March, we have made our initial recommendations for what we will retain and not retain, and that is published on our guide. And at that point, we open it up. We send out, again, a standard email to all of our departments, and we communicate through our monthly newsletter saying, now is the time, you have 6 weeks to give us your input. And that input goes in directly to the liaison librarians. In mid-March to April, they provide us those recommendations. Then in late April to mid-May, we have the down and dirty negotiations, because a lot of departments won't give you a lot of feedback. Many of them seem to be okay with what you do, or so beaten down that it doesn't, they don't talk to you anymore. But some will really be upset by things. A good example is when we left Wiley, we had some fairly hot meetings with anthropology because all the AAA journals are published by Wiley. So we had to figure out how we were going to retain a lot of those journals for them. In late May, we publish our final decisions, and those go into effect in January of the following calendar year. Again, we have a standard email for that, and it goes out in our newsletter. So in terms of impacts, the one deal that we have a long period of time to look at impact is the Oxford Agreement. That was canceled at the end of 2014, and frankly, the impact was minimal. We've had one title that we've reinstated since that time. The Wiley and Elsevier big deals were canceled at the end of 2018, but because the negotiation and the approval through legal took so long, we didn't actually lose access until the spring semester was over, essentially. So we really don't have enough data right now to tell you what the campus impact is. We did develop smaller 2-year agreements with Wiley and Elsevier for a smaller number of titles. We only did 2 years because we didn't feel comfortable in going out further than that. And we are currently working with Springer to get out of their big deal in favor of a smaller agreement as well. So we'll be out of all of our big STEM agreements at the end of 2019. Our impacts go beyond big deals. With a mandated permanent library reduction, we have canceled over $300,000 in databases since fiscal year 18. We continue to shrink our approval plans. We have made a conscious decision to keep about 70 social sciences and humanities publishers coming in print. And that's partly because those publishers tend to publish in disciplines where people are still wanting to see print on our campus, but also because as a profession, we're not making as much progress on loaning ebooks as we'd like, and so we want to have print books that we can loan and be a good community member. Most of our purchasing is demand-driven, both print and and as of this year, we canceled our foreign language approval plans and pushed that money back up in to handle our demand-driven. So the bottom line for OU, well, the budget reductions that we have experienced have occurred throughout our campus. It wasn't just the library that got hit, so everyone's in the same boat. The positive is that everyone understands that it can't be avoided. The negative is that we are less likely to have our constituents stand up and argue for the library budget for fear that if they do, there'll be something that's even closer to their hearts that will be cut that they need. So while the budget reduction mandate does provide cover for leaving big deals and the other things we've had to do, it's also limited our opportunities to engage our community with the issues facing us. So we still have that to address. And now we'll pass it on to Marilyn.
Hello, I'm Leanda Pope. I'm the head of acquisitions at the University of Maryland, College Park. The University of Maryland is the flagship institution for the University System of Maryland. We have an ARL ranking of 45 and are a member of multiple consortia. One of our biggest challenges is sharing our systems IT unit with the other 17 institutions in our state consortium. We have not experienced mandated budget cuts, but our annual collections budget has been flat for nearly 20 years. So with annual journal inflation and the conversion of print subscriptions to online, e-resources were quickly overtaking our budget. We have almost no options for increasing the collections budget, which leaves only a review or cancellation process as our alternative for keeping costs within budget. This chart shows which percentage of the electronic resources were canceled, which is the blue lines, compared to what percentage of the budget those resources consumed, which is the orange line, or the pink line. It was orange in another one. The FY17 figure represents our non-big deal journal review. You can see how small the cancellation amount is to the total e-resources. This clearly shows the majority of our journals are in big deal packages. We strive to spread the impact of our journal cancellations across all subject areas. This slide is the summary of our non-big deal journal review. It demonstrates the impact of review across Maryland subject groups. It becomes harder after multiple rounds of reviews to keep one area from taking the brunt of the impact. To ensure that our subject librarians understand the need for review, we have multiple layers of internal communication. First, we start the communication with our Collection Development Council, referred to as CDC, which is similar to an executive committee. Each of our subject groups have representatives on CDC, and those representatives pass along communication from CDC to their groups. Then we talked about the need for a review and the process for the review at library-wide meetings with subject librarians and collection managers. Our Collection Development Department creates and maintains both internal and public web-facing web pages about each review. The web pages provide details on the need for the review, the process, the timeline, and contact information. There are also numerous emails that are sent back and forth between collection development folks and subject librarians throughout the process. Finally, the outcome of the review is shared in meetings with CDC and collection managers as a whole. One of the ways we used the internal communication process was to have the collection managers run through a collection budget allocation exercise. This helps the collection managers understand the need for the resource reviews, and in this exercise, subject librarians were provided fake academic departments and collection allocation scenarios to consider. The objective was for them to decide how to divide the collection fund across the departments. So we purposely used fictional departments to keep them thinking outside of their own subject funds and about the concept in general.
So in terms of our external communication strategies, each of our subject librarians was expected to send emails to their department. We did provide them with some template language to include in those emails and in their communications with faculty. A lot of that included a description of the impact of journal inflation on the UMD collection budget, a definition of what a big deal is, reasons why that particular publisher contract was selected, and I'll just let you know it's because it happened to be the one up for renegotiation. The data we use to make those decisions, as well as some of the resources that we were then able to invest in with the cost savings that we'd never been able to purchase before because the money was tied up in a journal, in a big deal journal. We also included a public page with the relevant information. I've included the link there if you'd like to go and look at what we presented across campus. We also worked for the better part of 3 years with our University Library Council. This is an advisory body to the dean, but it's appointed jointly between the provost's office and the faculty, the University Senate. This is kind of a challenging group to work with because the teaching faculty that serve on this group in rotating terms, some of them may have more familiarity with how libraries work than others. So there's really a continuous learning curve with that group. Until just this past year, our AD for Collection Strategies and Services was not, in fact, an ex officio member of this group, which was challenging. The work we did with the group ultimately did produce a white paper, which we posted publicly. And that white paper in itself, some of the things that we focused on really had to do with educating our teaching faculty on new ways of doing business, and on the concepts of moving from just-in-case collecting methods to just-in-time models. Perhaps the biggest surprise for us, and pleasantly so, was there was not an enormous impact on ILL. We were really expecting the worst here, and were bracing for the worst in terms of ILL costs. As you can see in 2018, the big deal titles that were canceled generated only $7,600 worth of ILL costs versus the $424,900 of subscription costs annually. That represented only 5.3% of the overall ILL costs for the year after we canceled the big deal. So that was a nice thing for us. And really, this does illustrate that there is a difference between the e-journal use, which was 50 times higher in the previous year prior to canceling the big deal. So there's clearly, that result is not dissimilar to other institutions that have reported that same disconnect. It's clear here that there are significant differences in the factors that drive e-journal use versus ILL. In terms of our positive outcomes, we've had much more positive negotiations with publishers after this because they didn't want to be the next one. So one of them actually allowed us to step out of a deal at the same spending level as the previous year. Another one allowed us to extend our current terms for an added year onto the existing contract. We also were in a challenging situation in that we experienced 4 years of an interim dean situation, which makes it really challenging to make progress on new initiatives. Now that is over and we do have a permanent dean, we finally have some processes in place, including strategic planning processes that really will involve stakeholders from across the campus. There was no great hue and cry across campus on these titles. We did not hear from students or faculty. They didn't come at us with pitchforks. So again, we're not sure exactly why. We're just happy that we didn't see the pitchforks. Yes, we did cover our budget. Budget savings did cover inflation for the titles that we kept, but more importantly, we were able to reinvest those savings into resources that we had not been able to afford before. In terms of our continuing challenges, our work with ULC did not produce the advocacy we had hoped for. They chose not to forward our challenges onto the University Senate or advocate on our behalf with the provost. In part because the perception was that this was a library problem, and that was not a compelling argument for change. Since the focus was more on what was wrong with the library, in future, we're going to shift that conversation away from what's wrong with the library budget toward a discussion about publishing, access, contracts terms, authors' rights, those sorts of discussions. And of course, even with better terms from publishers, eventually inflation will impact us again. We're in a unique situation in that we were planning ahead. We were thinking more about how inflation would take over our budget. The challenge of that working with teaching units who were not experiencing that same dilemma was that they could not see this as a common problem. We've also identified a number of ways in which we might meet faculty at the point of need, but again, all of these are going to take significant investment in a new organizational structure, building new skills, and more importantly, new staffing models.
Okay, so I have compiled all of the survey results from the survey, so thank you all for taking that. And what we've done is, if I can, here we go. And okay, actually, I will just keep it in this view for now, and then I can highlight for you. We put all of this on one slide, so you could take a picture of it if you wanted to for those results, but I'll just go through these really quickly here. So have you gotten out of a big deal? 79 have gotten out of a big deal, 125 have not. And in terms of planning on getting out of a big deal, 92 said yes and 107 said no, so roughly half and half there. If you have gotten out of a big deal or are planning to, what is your reasoning? Overwhelmingly, you answered that it's due to budget. That's certainly the case at K-State, and I think that's the case for most of us, it looks like. If the decision was on principle, where did you reinvest the funds? So we had a few reply for APCs and open initiatives and on demand, but I think of those who canceled on principle, it looks like most subscribed to other resources that they could not afford otherwise while subscribing to the big deals. And then if you have funds to renegotiate your journal packages with a publisher, would you re-enter a big deal? 20 said yes, 86 said maybe. I think K-State would definitely be in the maybe camp. And 30 said no. 62 have not gotten out of a big deal. So I think these answers are not shocking, I think, to me and probably not to all of you, but I think it just reinforces that we're all sort of in the same boat here in terms of this situation and how it affects us on our campuses. So we have, let's see if I can view, present, here we go. We have compiled for you, maybe. There we go. We have compiled for you some resources if you're curious. Some of these are from Spark, and you probably are aware of these ones already, but if you are a picture taker in the audience and want to take a picture of these, go right ahead. These will also be posted in our slide deck and shed. And then we've also got some institutional resources. So these are resources from K-State, from OU, and from Maryland in terms of some of the documents and strategies that we've taken around these. And then we have some other institutional resources, including the UC Toolkit, some of the MIT materials, and other materials that we hope that you find helpful as you engage with these issues on your campuses as well. So that is what we have to share with you today. I think we've got a couple minutes left for questions if anybody has any. Thank you.
So we do have some time for questions. We have a microphone, and since this is being recorded, we're going to ask you to use the microphone, and remember to give your name and affiliation. And I'm happy to walk the microphone over to you if anyone would like to save a few steps. Do we have any questions?
One in the back.
In the back. Stop me when I get to you. Oh, sorry.
Robert Heaton, Utah State University. There was one mention of choosing to cancel this particular package because it was the one up for renewal. As we're considering, we're trying to be fair across all and set kind of a criteria. I'm curious how each of you have maybe done that to look at all the data and say, this is why we're doing this, or was there just a decision we're going to cut them all, or how you've been fair among choosing among publishers to cut or not cut?
In our case, we had already focused our attention on non-big deal titles. We didn't want to go back to that because we felt that that really would inordinately impact those journal publishers that are not part of the large publisher conglomerates. In terms of our decision-making and timing, again, it was purely because that one happened to be the one that was first up for renegotiation. We will focus continuously on serial reviews and cuts as needed to offset inflation. So this could be anyone else in the near future.
we got out of Wiley first because it was up first, and that was the year that we had to cut $379,000. And the next year when we had a $900,000 cut, well, we could cut Elsevier. We were coming to the end of that agreement, and we were coming to the end of the Springer agreement that we're dealing, well, following year was the Springer agreement, this current year. So it was just a matter of timing. But we picked those because that's where the bulk of the big deal money resided in our budget.
I don't have much to add, except that timing played the biggest factor for us, and when we had to cut what amount.
Rob Thiessen, University of Calgary. I was just curious about the University of Oklahoma's two little big deals with Elsevier and Wiley. I don't know what you can share. Anything you can share about the size of those deals, or kind of percentage savings off of list price, if it's possible?
Well, between the two of them, we saved close to $500,000. And that's what we were looking for. We were looking to meet our target amounts. Do we have every title that we'd want to have? No. We had to satisfy, we had to save this much money, and here are the titles that we think we need most. And if we chose wrongly, we will adjust accordingly the next go round.
Linny Argerbright, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So all of the ILL results were rather low, and I was wondering if you went back to a faculty departmental meeting, and asked them maybe would the results of their satisfaction possibly show a similar degree of not really needing it. Do you think? Was that a clear question?
First of all, I don't know. What I'm very curious about, and I think probably a lot of people in this room is where else are they getting their requests fulfilled? Because I think I see the heads nodding, we all feel like they're not coming through us, but they're doing it somehow. Are they writing to the authors? Are they calling friends at institutions that still have access? As much as we try to convince them that they should go through interlibrary loans, so we have the data that proves we need to reestablish a subscription, they don't necessarily do that.
We have heard the criticism of interlibrary loan taking too long for some of our researchers, and it's shocking to hear how many are working on grants, at 11 o'clock at night and things like that, where they need access right now to whatever article they're looking for. We haven't done any correlation analysis between the interlibrary loan numbers that we're seeing and which titles were expressed as critical in some of our survey work, but it would be an interesting study for sure. Yeah.
Likewise, we are wondering the same thing. If they're bypassing the library, where are they going? What venue are they using? And more importantly, who? So we do plan at some point to investigate that, because for us, increasingly, ILL is becoming a part of our collection development strategy. So we do need to understand what motivates ILL use or disuse.
Jason Price from the Skelk Library Consortium. On the ILL note, I also wonder what role post-cancellation access plays in that. So you are canceling these big deals. This is presumably just that first year's content. So I'm wondering if the minor impact on ILL is actually that surprising. I think someone had some forecasts, and I assume that was because it's growing each year. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
That is something that we're watching, because we do have forecasts from our IL department about the impact that the big deal cancellation would make. But our first big deal we canceled was only in 2018, and it is impacting us now in this calendar year. So we are going to watch that going forward, because we would suspect in 5 or 10 years that that might be an impact, because we would not have access for post cancellation after 2019.
I will say, however, that our ILL unit has already done a vast amount of crunching their own numbers. What they have determined is that the vast majority of use, no shock, is for current content. So the fact that we experienced such a low number the year after we did this cancellation, and we knew we did not have access to that year's content, is something we're interpreting as a positive sign.
That last one.
I just have to say, some of that analysis has to be looking at Sci-Hub use and how much that's changed to the level you can get that data in a geographically helpful way. I mean, I think the question is, are faculty getting these articles anyway and not through the library, or are they not getting them? And that's a bigger question, but it's a really important one to think about, I think.
Always glad we can mention Sci-Hub at one of these things. Thanks. So that's all the time we have. I want to thank the panel for their presentations today.